Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive with us. Today we're going to be taking a look at this article called The Modern Traps of Addiction and Distraction.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, it's all about how we live in this world that's constantly connected and how that can sometimes leave us feeling a little bit empty even though we have like everything at our fingertips.
Yeah, it's a weird paradox, right?
Right.
Like, we have more information and experiences than ever, but sometimes it feels like true fulfillment is harder to come by.
Totally.
Yeah.
And this article dives right into like the why behind that. And it starts off talking about this app called Blinkist. Have you ever heard of that?
I have, yeah. It's like it gives you these condensed versions of non-fiction books,
Yeah,
right?
exactly. Like
Mm.
the Spark Notes version, but for grown-ups.
Right, like for busy people who want to learn but don't have a ton of time.
Exactly. And on the surface, it sounds pretty awesome. Like who wouldn't want to absorb knowledge that quickly?
Yeah.
But the article makes this point about how, always chasing after these quick hits of information can actually be kind of a trap.
I see what you mean. It's like we're always looking for the next shiny thing, but we never really stop to appreciate what we've already got.
Yeah. And the article talks about how this ties into our brain's reward system. Like every time we encounter something new, we get this little burst of dopamine.
Right, and that dopamine rush feels good, so we end up craving more and more novelty. It's like a cycle that's hard to break.
Totally. And it's like we're always chasing after that next hit of pleasure, but it never really lasts, does it?
Nope, it's fleeting. It's like you said, always looking for the next shiny thing.
It's like when you binge watch a show. Like you get so hooked on finding out what happens next, and then you finish the whole season and you're like, wait, that's it. I just feel kind of empty.
Haha, exactly. And the article argues that this constant need for novelty can actually be a form of escapism. Like we're so busy chasing the next thrill that we avoid dealing with the stuff that might actually bring us lasting fulfillment.
So it's like we end up feeling busy and stimulated, but not actually fulfilled.
Exactly. And that can be a recipe for a lot of unhappiness, even if it looks like we're living exciting lives.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
And then the article takes this even further and talks about digital addiction. Now, when I first heard that term, I was like, wait, hold on. I don't think I'm addicted to anything.
Right.
But the more I read, the more I realized that it's not really about substances. It's more about behavior patterns.
Right. It's about that constant pull we feel towards our devices, the feeling that we need to be connected 24/7.
Yeah, and that fragmented attention. Like
Yeah.
we're always jumping from one notification to the next to the next. And I think that can actually rewire our brains over time.
They can make it harder to focus and be present in the real world, for sure.
And the article shares this story about someone who traveled all over the place, constantly experiencing new things.
Hmm.
Sounds pretty amazing, right? But they started feeling super anxious and disconnected, like they were missing something important.
Wow. So even with all those new experiences, they still felt empty.
Yeah, it's like their brain was on overdrive,
Yeah.
but they weren't actually present in any of those moments.
That's really powerful. And it makes you think, doesn't it? Like, how much time do we spend on our devices each day? And how does it actually make us feel?
Right. Are you using technology or is it using us? That's a question we all need to be asking ourselves.
Definitely. It's not about judgment. It's about awareness, like becoming more aware of our habits and how they might be impacting our well-being.
Totally. And that brings us to this other point that the article makes about relationships. The author talks about how difficult it was to reconnect with old friends after all that travel. Like they'd changed, but so had their friends, and there was this disconnect they couldn't quite bridge.
That's so interesting because it shows how our relationship with technology can actually impact our real-world connections.
Right. It's like we're so used to those quick surface level interactions online that we forget what it takes to build deep, meaningful relationships.
And those take time and effort and vulnerability, right?
Absolutely. You can't just rush intimacy and connection. It's like tending a garden. You have to nurture those relationships over time.
That's a great analogy. And it makes you realize that maybe we've been going about this whole connection thing all wrong.
So the question is, how do we find that balance? How do we stay connected to the world without getting lost in all the noise and distraction? And that's something we're going to explore in the next part of our deep dive. So stay tuned.
So, the article then goes on to talk about this turning point for the author, where they were trying to reconnect with a close friend. And it was like this aha moment for them. They realized that their constant need for new things and stimulation had actually made it harder to really be present and connect on a deeper level.
Yeah, I can totally relate to that. Like we all have those moments where we suddenly become aware of our own habits and we're like, wait a minute, is this actually serving me or am I just stuck in this like autopilot mode?
Right. And the article calls this self-awareness. It's like the first step towards breaking free from these patterns that aren't really serving us.
It makes sense. And then it goes on to talk about understanding the why behind our behaviors. Like, why do we do the things we do?
Mhm.
And it brings up this concept of the negativity bias. Have you heard of that?
Yeah, it's like our brains are kind of hardwired to focus on threats and negative information. It's like a survival mechanism from way back when. But in today's world, that can actually lead to a lot of anxiety and negativity, especially with like the constant influx of information we're bombarded with.
So it's like our brains are kind of working against us in a way.
In a sense, yeah. But the good news is that we can actually retrain our brains to be more positive and present.
And the article gives us some hope, right? Like it talks about practical steps we can take to regain control of our attention and find more balance.
Exactly. And it really emphasizes the importance of mindfulness, like being present in the moment and making conscious choices about how we're spending our time and energy.
I like that. And one of the steps it suggests is mindful consumption. So even when we're using tools like Blinkist that we talked about earlier, it's about like slowing down, savoring the information, and really connecting it to what we already know.
Right. It's about quality over quantity, for
Yeah.
sure, not just racing through things to get to the next thing.
And the article also talks about limiting screen time,
Yeah.
which is something we all hear all the time. But honestly, it's easier said than done right.
It can be tough,
Hmm.
but there are small steps we can take, like setting boundaries for ourselves. Maybe designating certain times of the day as device-free zones, or like physically separating ourselves from our phones at night, like not charging them in our bedrooms.
Yeah, those are good tips.
Yeah.
And then there's this whole piece about building relationships slowly,
Yeah.
which feels almost counterintuitive in our world of like instant connections. But the article makes a strong case for it.
Yeah. It reminds us that those truly meaningful connections take time and effort. They don't just happen overnight.
It's like that saying, Rome wasn't built in a day.
Right.
Relationships are the same way. You can't just rush them.
Exactly. And the article even suggests checking out some books on fulfillment to learn more about this stuff. It specifically mentions The World Beyond Your Head and Dopamine Nation.
Oh, I've heard of those.
Huh.
What are some of the key takeaways from those books that you think our listener would find helpful?
Well, The World Beyond Your Head really dives into how our environment shapes our attention. Like, it argues that all the constant stimuli we're exposed to in modern life is actually rewiring our brains, making it harder to focus and find stillness.
That's fascinating. And what about Dopamine Nation?
That one explores the neuroscience of addiction. It explains how our brains are wired to seek pleasure and avoid pain, but that wiring can get kind of hijacked by the constant dopamine hits we get from technology.
That makes sense. So it's not about like totally rejecting technology, but learning to use it in a way that serves us instead of controls us.
Exactly. And both books offer some strategies for reclaiming our attention and finding balance in this world that's designed for overstimulation.
I love that. It's empowering to know that we have that choice. And speaking of mindfulness, have you found any practices or techniques that have been particularly helpful for you in your own life?
You know, something as simple as taking a few deep breaths before I check my phone can make a world of difference.
Yeah, just that little pause, that moment of awareness can really change how we interact with technology.
It helps you make a conscious choice instead of just reacting automatically.
I like that. And I think that's a great takeaway for our listeners.
Yeah.
What's one small thing you can do today to be more present and break free from that cycle of distraction?
Maybe it's putting your phone on Do Not Disturb for an hour, or taking a walk without headphones, or just having a real face-to-face conversation with someone you care about.
All great ideas.
Yeah.
And it's not about being perfect, right? It's about progress, making those small changes over time.
Exactly. And those small changes can really add up and make a big difference in our lives.
So we've been talking a lot about like personal well-being and stuff,
Mm-hmm.
but I'm also thinking about the bigger picture here. Like, do you think this constant craving for novelty that we've been talking about could be like impacting our ability to deal with those really big, complex problems that we're facing as a society?
Oh, that's a really interesting question. You mean like things like climate change or social inequality?
Exactly. Like those issues that need like sustained attention and collaboration to solve.
Yeah, I think that's definitely something to consider. Like, if we're always looking for that next quick hit of information or stimulation, it does make it harder to really grapple with those problems that require, like, deep thinking patience and a willingness to, like, sit with discomfort.
Right. It's like we're wired for instant gratification, but these big problems require a much longer term perspective.
And a commitment to working together, even when it's hard.
Yeah, for sure.
Mm.
So maybe this whole mindfulness thing that we've been talking about is even more important than we realized.
Absolutely. Like, we need to be able to focus, resist distractions, and engage in those meaningful conversations, even when there aren't easy answers.
It's like we need to retrain our brains to value depth over speed, substance over sensation.
I love that. And I think the practical steps that the article talked about, like mindful consumption, limiting screen time, building relationships slowly, all of those things can help us cultivate that kind of mindset.
It's like a recipe for a more fulfilling life, but also a more impactful one. Like we can actually make a difference in the world if we can break free from these traps of distraction.
I totally agree. It's not about being perfect. It's about making progress, taking those small steps each day to align our actions with our values.
I like that. And this deep dive into the modern traps of addiction and distraction has really given me a lot to think about.
Me too. It's a powerful reminder that we have a choice in how we engage with the world.
We really do. And even small changes can make a big difference.
Absolutely. And remember, you're not alone in this. We all struggle with distraction and the allure of novelty, but we can do this.
We can. And to our listeners out there, we highly recommend checking out those books we mentioned, The World Beyond Your Head and Dopamine Nation. They offer some really great insights and practical strategies for finding balance in this crazy world.
It's been great chatting with you about all this.
Likewise. And to everyone listening, thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We hope you found it helpful and inspiring. And remember, keep those brains curious. We'll catch you on the next one.